We're so excited to announce our partnership with Simple Practice.
Looking for an EHR that's built for the way therapists work? From automated scheduling and billing to customizable notes and treatment plans, Simple Practice gives you everything you need right at your fingertips. Learn more at simplepractice.com.
Looking for expert speakers for your next event? Curt Widhalm and Katie Vernoy, that's me, deliver engaging workshops on clinical, legal, ethical, and business topics. Give your audience practical tools to thrive as modern therapists. Learn more at therapyreimagined.com.
You're listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide, where therapists live, breathe, and practice as human beings. To support you as a whole person and a therapist, here are your hosts, Curt Widhalm and Katie Vernoy.
Welcome back, Modern Therapists. This is the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. I'm Curt Widhalm with Katie Vernoy, and this is the podcast that is considering changing its name to the Uncharted Territory podcast, a show that would help therapists navigate the wild, untamed frontier of modern day practice. We're talking about a whole new frontier that we're dealing with, documenting our clients' deepest, most personal concerns in a political climate that feels a little bit less than friendly these days, if we're trying to sugarcoat things here from the top of it. So we're really talking about when a client shares their struggles about such things as LGBTQ plus issues, abortion access issues. It's not just a clinical issue anymore. It's a legal one. We talked about this a couple of years ago in documenting in multi-state situations, knowing all of the different states. Now we're rolling it out nationally, and a episode that is really about this be used against my client in court. And helping us dive into this today is our good friend, Maelisa McCaffrey. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise on how the hell we document things these days.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Not necessarily happy to talk about the topic, but also happy to talk about the topic. Let's get into it.
It's so good to see you and have you back on the show. We'll link to all, the other episodes you've been on in the show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com. But before we get into this, let's have you answer the question we ask all of our guests, which is, who are you and what are you putting out to the world?
Yeah, I am an ADHD, not rule-loving, super not type A person who teaches other therapists how to document. And that is as in conflict as it sounds, right? And so because documentation, details, specifics, even to some degree rule following is not my go-to thing, I had to get really good at it very early on in the profession. And over time, created a business called QA Prep where I help mental health therapists with their documentation and found out it was a really big need. And it has blown up and I love it. And I've been talking about documentation for 12 years now, which is crazy. And I literally had a new thing come up. I created a new template yesterday. That's how crazy some of this stuff can be, in that it takes that long of obsessing over these things and doing this literally full time. I do this full time. And I just created a new template strategy yesterday. So if you're struggling with documentation and it hasn't been your full-time job for 12 years, it's understandable. But yeah, that's me. And so I have been getting a lot of questions about documenting sensitive and politically charged topics, much more so the last 6 months. But it has been a concern, I think, since Roe v. Wade and since states started having different abortion laws and people are now commonly licensed in more than one state. And so I know you guys had another episode where you kind of talked about that. And that's really where I think between that and then dealing with teenagers and LGBTQ and specifically transgender identity issues as well, those used to be the more common questions. And now I'm getting questions about all kinds of things from people's legitimate concern.
What are the fears and questions that you are getting?
I'm getting questions about, obviously, transgender status, I would say that question used to be a lot more specific to working with teenagers, and being concerned about, like, could someone's parents or guardians access their records, and what might happen if you keep that information secret, good and bad, right? And now I get that question for people who are adults, right? Because it used to be I could say, well, if you have a queer client and they're 25 years old, they get to decide what they're going to do with their records, and you just work with them on that, right? And you just kind of inform them. Now I'm getting questions about, like, should I document that my 40-year-old client is in a lesbian relationship? Specifics like that weren't a concern before. Other questions about things like immigration status and do I need to have an ID on file, and what are the rules around this, and can I document it? Should I document it? And I think the biggest thing is that a lot of these issues, immigration status, considering an abortion, having some type of a queer identity or lifestyle, these are all things that clients talk about in therapy a lot, right? So it's not like something where I can give you one phrase to use and then you can just use that once and you never have to address it again. If you are talking with a teen, for example, you might be discussing their transgender identity and their struggles around that every single session. And so it's both something that we want to, protect our clients from harm as best we can. And, like, we can't just lie and pretend that these things are not in existence. And I would even argue that to pretend that some of these things don't exist is a disservice in some ways to some clients, right? We don't want to minimize that this is an important issue to them. And we want to think through what are potential consequences. I will say those potential consequences, that's another question I get a lot is, I've always gotten the question, how much is too much in a progress note? And, am I writing too much or am I writing too little? That's probably one of my first blog posts ever, right? And I'll probably always get that question, and that applies across the board. But now it feels like the stakes are much higher. Because it used to be, well, my client, for example, did something. They were driving drunk and got in an accident and then talked to me about it. Can I document that, right? Is that too much or too little? And it used to be thinking through consequences like that for people. Now it's thinking ahead to, I'm seeing trends in the world or in the country or in my state, and I don't know if the environment might be different in a year, in 6 months. And I'm also getting questions about now the environment is different in my state, especially. And should I go back and change documentation? Should I go back and change what I wrote last year? Because last year I wasn't worried about this and now I am. So those are the common questions that I'm getting, or how much detail, what phrases to use. Do I change my documentation?
It seems like documentation is one of those things that has been the bane of therapist existence for all time. And I even remember one of my first supervisors said, write very little. And I haven't written a note for years. And I'm going to, if I get, my records subpoenaed or whatever, I'll just make it up, and
which is not a strategy we recommend.
No, it's not. It's a horrible strategy. It was a horrible, horrible strategy. But I think it's something where there was that element of, I'm going to scribble my notes. I'm going to write very little. And I think there's that end of the spectrum all the way to my documentation as a bill. I need to have the, medical necessity and all of the things that are going to help me bill, like Medicaid or those types of things. And I need to remember things. So I need to have all of these things here and so much detail. And it feels like it just feels impossible to navigate at this point, because if I put something in my notes that I don't remember what it means, or I don't remember what happened in the session, I think that is a disservice to clients. But if I put too much information and documentation is subpoenaed or just commandeered or whatever, my client could really be at risk. And so what is the advice that you're giving at this point? We've got kind of previous Melissa's advice around the clinical loop and all the things. So good documentation. We've got that covered. We'll put that in the show notes. But I think there's this almost strategic defensive documentation that we're talking about right now.
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked it that way because I have been pretty open about saying I have changed my advice very recently and used to think about this a little bit differently. And I would hope that others can see that as professional development and like we all have to adapt. Anyone who's been in the field for 30 years can tell you everything is different than it was 30 years ago, right? That's going to happen. So that's not bad in and of itself. But, to get really existential about it, I used to see kind of like your supervisor's experience. I used to view that, and I think that's because of a lot of the mentality behind that. I'm assuming that supervisor wasn't saying that because they just felt stressed and didn't want to write notes. It was like almost this elitist attitude of I know better than whatever entity is coming in. How dare they question me? I don't need to give them what they want.
Exactly.
My clients don't need to see that. How dare, HIPAA exist and my clients potentially have access to their records. That was a very common mindset. And I think still exists in some circles. And I have always very much rejected that idea and really taken the view that regardless of the entity, so I'm agnostic, I say, about insurance, right? So if you want to use insurance, there's good reasons to do it. If you don't want to use insurance, there's good reasons not to use it. So I, would never fault anyone either way as a therapist for accepting or not accepting insurance. But if you do, you have to acknowledge the reality of you'll need to document more and you'll need to document certain things. That's just the reality. I don't think it needs to be extreme. But ultimately, all of these issues, we tend to get very hung up on our own beliefs, our own feelings about it. And honestly, that matters very little. What is the most important is informed consent. That's always been the most important. The fact that your clients should know that you document. That should not be a question. And if you have clients in any of these sensitive or politically charged scenarios, if you have clients who are kids or teenagers, right? Anything where if you see couples, anything where the fact that you are documenting things can be a little bit more high stakes than for the kind of average, right, individual with depression, that should be something that we're talking about with people.
As a therapist, your time is precious, and Simple Practice helps you protect it. Their new AI-powered note taker creates structured progress notes in minutes, so you can wrap up sessions and move on with your day. Easy-to-use billing features take the hassle out of getting paid, even when insurance is involved.
Another great perk? Scheduling is simple for you and your clients with unlimited automated appointment reminders. Make the most of every day with an all-in-one practice management solution that lets you focus on the work that matters most, connecting with your clients. Join over 225,000 practitioners who trust Simple Practice to keep their day running smoothly. Start today at simplepractice.com. What does that conversation look like? Because I think there's a lot of things, especially working with teenagers, where you can say, look, I want to have this very upfront conversation that I'm going to be documenting things. And this could get really scary for you. And teenage brain going, yeah, whatever. I click on all kinds of terms of service without reading through them. And I'm totally, 18 on the internet for lots of things and not really having beyond adolescent brain and thinking about the consequences. So even how does that conversation look like?
Yeah, exactly. So I think the first session, it may or may not be a big deal for people. Right. And that's the thing, the insurance conversation, right? I always say, you need to tell people that you have to give them a diagnosis. You should never give someone a mental health diagnosis and let them, without them being aware, you will do that. Right. And some people are yeah, okay, whatever. They really don't care. For other people, that is full stop. Whoa, what are we doing here? That's a big deal for them. This in that vein, this is the same discussion. So for a kid who's transgender, there are kids whose families are aware, whose families are supportive. You're still going to have the same conversation with them, right? About like, I would just want you to know I have to take notes. I'll be taking notes about things. If you ever have questions about them, obviously depending on your state and the age of the kid and what the various laws are there. But usually you can give the kids access when they're in that adolescent range in most states. You know, you can say, even if you can't, even if you're in a state where like adolescents don't have any rights to their records and you have to be 18, you can still say, you can always ask me about what I'm going to write. You can always ask me about what I might say. And then I think then you see where the person is, right? So whether that's an adult, whether it's a teen, it doesn't really matter. You see where they are and how they respond and whether or not they care. And then if the person doesn't care, great. Like, don't obsess over something that they don't care about, right? Move on to the other relevant informed consent things that you've got to talk about with people. But remembering that informed consent is not intake. It is not a form. It's a process. And it's a process that we have throughout therapy with people. And that means it might come up again. And a lot of us have had this happen where 6 months in, someone shares something with you and you're like, oh man, I have to write a child abuse report. Or you're working with a kid and you're like, oh crap, I might actually have to talk to the parent about this one, right? And that's where, to maintain the relationship and to practice informed consent, then you have that conversation in session about, I'm a little concerned about this for whatever reason, or, I want you to know I'll have to make this report, or I'll have to talk to this person, or I'll need to consult on this topic, right? Whatever that might be, it's making sure that you inform people. That's what's going to happen. I think what takes this to the next level in our current circumstances is potentially when you have that uncomfortable feeling, when you're going to write something down, or if you're using AI, you see the way the AI wrote something for you. If you're like, I don't know if that sounds right, or I don't know if I should be writing that, or if I should put that down on, like, actually document that word or that phrase or that thing, I would trust that gut feeling. And if you are in a place where you kind of doubt your gut feeling, or you kind of trust the gut feeling, but you're like, I don't know if this is my stuff, right? Then consult with somebody about it, or listen to this podcast, or watch one of my YouTube videos, right? But get some support instead of just ignoring that feeling. And so my recommendation is always that if that first feeling happens and you're either able to talk to the client about it before you finalize that note, or if you have a supervisor, or if the client is there and you're kind of thinking about like, oh crap, how am I going to document this? Talk with the client first, right? And say like, hey, I'm wondering if, I'm thinking about the fact that that I write notes, and I'm thinking about how I need to document this. Do you have any preferences? It doesn't mean that you have to do what the client is going to say, because we can't always promise to do that. So never promise to do that. But I do think it's relevant here when we're talking about LGBTQ issues, when we're talking about even immigration status. I'm even thinking of, people who are citizens, but maybe have members of their family who are not citizens, right? Ask them, how would you like me to describe that? How would you like me to write that down? Do you have feelings either way about how I write that down? Or I commonly use this word. Does that apply to you? And I think that as a field, we have gotten more sensitive to doing that in general with things like pronouns. 10 years ago, like pronouns and intake paperwork were not really as much of a thing as they might be now, right? That's one example of, I think, how as a field we have adapted to start to do that and be a little bit more open with not only what are legal definitions of things, but how do people want to be described? How do people want to be addressed? And so viewing it in that way and talking with them about, for abortion, for example, like I usually recommend just using the word pregnancy loss, because that gives you the freedom to still discuss all the issues that are related to abortion that people commonly have. And some clients might it might be one session, it might be a one-off thing. For other clients, it might be a devastating topic, right? For a variety of reasons. Or for some clients, it just might be a big topic of discussion. And you want to be able to address it. And so if you say pregnancy loss, that is real. Like, you're not lying there. That's what happened. And it accurately kind of reflects the level of grief and depth of things that can happen. And I think more accurately aligns with the types of things you're likely to document about that session. But ask your client. I usually use the phrase pregnancy loss when we talk about abortion in a therapy session. Do you have any feelings about that? Do you have any concerns about that? Do you have any preferences? And see what clients have to say. I do think where this is also similar to the insurance conversation of some clients really don't care, right? And they're just like the diagnosis thing. They're like, yeah, okay, whatever. Just give me a diagnosis. I don't even care. I don't even need to know. And part of our professional role is to think ahead a little bit. And so don't get conspiracy theory with your clients, but, to say I have seen or I have heard in a training that, this could potentially be a negative if this word is used. So I prefer to say pregnancy loss over abortion, right? Just as an example. So if your client doesn't care, that also doesn't give you carte blanche to just write everything. I would say still use your professional judgment to try and document accurately, but sensitively. I also tell people focus less on the buzzwords and more on the general topic, right? So abortion, that's the buzzword. That's the politically charged word. But the issues, the feelings, the discussions around it, that's often about grief. It's often about religious beliefs. It's often about desires and wants. And it's often about disagreements with a partner, right? It's all of those things. And those things you can document accurately.
Need dynamic, knowledgeable speakers for your next event, training, or conference? Curt Widhalm, that's me, and Katie Vernoy, that's her, bring real-world expertise to every presentation, covering topics like supervision, private practice growth, and therapist burnout. Our workshops are interactive, insightful, and packed with actionable strategies to help modern therapists succeed.
Whether you're planning a team training or a large-scale event, Curt and I deliver high-impact learning experiences tailored to your needs. Book us today. Visit therapyreimagined.com to learn more. I like a lot of this. There's a part of this that feels a bit uncomfortable to me, and I wanted to put that out there because I think there's some advice that I need and also maybe, a different perspective to share. When I think about talking to my clients about documentation, I feel like it has a similar flair to some of the ways that I've talked about child abuse reporting. And this is what my responsibility is, and this is, if you're talking about this is what's going to happen, and this is how all of that's going to be, and this is how, and potentially this is how it might be documented, those types of things. And I feel like it is informed, and I feel like there's a part of this that then leads to clients not feeling able to talk about the things that they really need to talk about in therapy. I also feel like in asking them how they want their work to be documented or having that conversation in more depth, it puts a different pressure on them to try to understand it. It may increase their anxiety. It's something where my default is I'm cautious. I'm talking about the underlying issues, not the buzzwords. I like that. That's a really good piece of advice. I like that. I think that's kind of what I've been doing by nature. But it is something where it does add a responsibility to the clients, and it potentially may have the clients not feel completely safe to talk about all the stuff that they want to talk about in therapy.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that's why you do gauge how interested they are in it, how concerned they are, obviously, and use your professional judgment in when and how you bring it up, right? And that's why I do say, don't get conspiracy theory with people and start going to all the worst case scenarios. Because we can never predict all of those, right? And we're not doing that when we talk about child abuse reporting, even though that can be a really big deal when that does happen, right?
Sure.
Instead, I would say, most of the therapists who are coming to me with these questions are coming to me this is where it's important to look at what are my feelings and what are my client's feelings.
Yeah.
So like if your client is talking about being super terrified under the Trump administration and literally hiding or not feeling like they can't go to work because raids are happening in their city or they know someone who was taken, right? If that is happening, that means they're concerned about it.
Sure.
And so I would say I agree with you, like let your clients take the lead in a lot of that, where I think if your client is actively talking about it or worried about it, they will feel really relieved to know that you get it and to know that you're thinking about that as well. And so kind of match that energy with them. Whereas other people who maybe are a little bit less concerned, yeah, I wouldn't go into the big, deep conversation. Instead, I would just very unemotionally let them know, right? It's just like a statement about, I document, this is the word I use. Do you have any preferences? If you have any questions, you can let me know. And then if they just want to move on, then you just move on and you bring it up. But I do think it brings up for me that I have feelings about this. A lot of other therapists have feelings about this. And I try to be mindful because I know that regardless of your political views, for example, you're going to have to document about abortion if you work with young women, right? And so regardless of what you feel about abortion, you might have to talk to a client about it and you might have to document it. And when you go to document it, it might give you pause, regardless of what your personal feelings are about it. And so I do think it's important that we evaluate what are our own feelings and discomfort and manage that and regulate it as much as we can, right? So don't watch the news for an hour before you do a bunch of client sessions. Because unless you're looking at Taylor Swift being engaged, because that's the only happy news right now. But you know what I mean? Be mindful of what you're bringing to the session. Because I do think that there's a heavy feeling around a lot of this, and it's very easy to bring that to your clients, and that is not what we want to do. We want to bring it in an emotional way and kind of match what their energy is with it. And so if they are really concerned, we want to show them we value that concern and that we would like to take their opinion into consideration. And if they're not really concerned and we don't have reason to be, then or if we are concerned, we don't need to put that on our client, right? Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
I think the other part of this that is something that kind of goes along with this is the times when we hedge or that we don't necessarily put all the things in there. The thing that came up for me is the threat of an autistic registry or potentially even, folks with gender dysphoria, identity dysphoria, those types of things, where an actual diagnosis might be the danger. And for me, that gets into accuracy, talking to your client about it. I mean, there's a lot there. So do you have ideas on what to do about those things?
Yeah. In that, I would say give yourself a lot of grace. You can only do the best you can with the information you have available at the time. And none of us knew that some of this stuff was going to happen 6 months ago or 6 years ago. And so you can never know potentially, that is a great example, potentially an autism registry and having a diagnosis of that. And for other people, having that actual diagnosis is extremely valuable because that gets them services they need.
Sure.
And without it, they're not getting access to desperately needed services. And so a lot of these things are not always all good or all bad. And with documentation, I see that all the time. I've seen examples of people who use the I'm going to write as little as possible strategy, and they're not billing to insurance. And so they don't worry about medical necessity, and they don't want to use a diagnosis, and they really don't like the word impairment. So they don't emphasize that in their notes. And then their client has something significant happen and applies for disability, and their client was denied. And thankfully, in that circumstance, because this is a real circumstance that happened, thankfully, that person also had a psychiatrist. And guess what? The psychiatrists don't worry about that. So psychiatrist notes were great and helped this person get a service they needed. But for that clinician that I was working with, it was very eye-opening to see actually documenting in a way I don't necessarily ascribe to or feel comfortable with, but documenting accurately could have helped my client. And I almost did my client a real disservice. And thankfully, somebody else did, document in a different way. And on the flip side, there are circumstances where your clients can have negative things happen because of accurate things you write. And it's really not our role to make that determination. It just isn't, because like I talk about with court cases, I mean, if you have a good attorney or they have a good attorney, they'll make it work either way. It's not so much about what you write. And so I do want therapists to take some of that pressure off of themselves. Yes, we want to consider it ethically. Yes, that's why I really go back to always emphasizing informed consent. Because it's not about trying to predict the future. It's about letting your client know this is always a risk. And when clients have things documented about them, regardless of whether or not in the moment you think it's good or bad, that is always a risk.
Everyone would have thought that a podcast about documentation would turn into a ethical versus moral debate. And I think that that's really what's underlying this, is trying to wrestle with really what are your morals. And, by the very nature of being licensed, you've agreed with the jurisdiction that you're in to follow certain protocols. I think to credit you for already giving kind of some suggestions as far as different ways to maybe phrase things in some of the documentation that might weave that golden line of helping clients line things. Are there other parts of the client file that we need to consider, whether it be what's written in our informed consent, our documentation of intake questionnaires? Are there other places that we should really be thinking about things that we haven't discussed yet?
Yes, I will. So we've all heard the phrase, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. And I think like way back in the day, I probably even said that myself. I really like a much better phrase, and I will quote Eric Strom. I don't know if you've ever had him on the podcast, but he's both an attorney and a licensed counselor. And what he says instead is, if it's in the record, think about why. And so it's always okay to question things. Like, do I need a copy of my client's ID? A lot of the things we do because they were always done wherever we were before, or because somebody else did them. But is that a rule? I'll tell you that's not a law. At least it could be a law in some states. It's not a law in states I'm aware of. It often is a requirement related to insurance, if you take insurance, right? And so it's not that things are always good or bad or even have to be done. And so questioning things, like when you're like, oh my gosh, some people are having this existential, like this huge crisis about whether or not I have a client's ID. And it's like, well, do you even need it? Right? Like, is it a requirement? And never, I would even say this about my advice, anything you hear on this podcast or any other podcast, your question is always, what's your source? So if somebody tells you, well, you have to do that, then say, what's your source? Right? Because a lot of people, their only source is some random supervisor or some experience they had. Or even, I can tell you as a former QA person at a few different agencies, they're QA person at an agency. That person is just telling you whatever is that agency's policy. And they might tell you it's because Medicare said this, but often that's not accurate. So never trust just a person or hearsay. Always go back to like, what's your source? And think about that for yourself. So if you're looking through your records and you're like, I don't like that I have to do this. Well, then look at, why is it in your record? Do you actually have to have it? And it does take a little bit of digging, but I think if it's, don't do that with everything, right? Because that would be crazy making, and you'll never finish looking at your documentation ever. So do that with the things that are really causing you anxiety, right? The things you're absolutely concerned about, then yes, those are the things you prioritize, taking some time to look at, is this an actual rule or law that I need to follow? And remember that even with that, we can all have, reasonable clinicians can disagree on these issues and have different policies and practices, and that's okay. And you can have a different policy and practice around documentation than another clinician that you respect.
There's always concerns that I have around kind of what Curt was talking about, the legal ethical versus moral arguments. And when we're talking about whether it's the autism registry or folks that are seeking asylum or, folks that may actively be targeted by the current administration, and depending on how medical records are treated in the future, there could be ways in which these records are used against them or used to identify them, whether it's a diagnosis or even just key phrases. And so I know you talked about the phrase for abortion being pregnancy loss. Do you have other types of advice for some of the hot button issues that people are facing right now, as far as how do we accurately document but don't put a target on our client's back?
Yeah, I think the one that is, so for abortion, it's often pregnancy loss. For transgender, I often, especially if you're working with teens, I talk about identity issues,
Sure.
right? Questioning identity, because that's very common for all of us, I guess, but
Yes.
more so for adolescents, right? And, or even just discussing sexuality, right? That's, I don't think anyone thinks it's unusual that a clinician is talking to an adolescent client about sexuality in general. And for immigration, that one I do struggle with a little bit more. And so I'll be honest, that one's a little bit more of a stretch. But my recommendations are really to focus on like the related issues. So things such as transitions, things such as housing insecurity is a phrase that you might be able to use. Things such as housing instability or just instability in their life in general, right? Because these are a lot of the experiences of people right now. Things such as family conflict, things such as cultural identity.
I've also used safety, that client is worried about their family member's safety.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's especially helpful. And that's where it can get a little bit more tricky. Like if your client is the one who you're worried about with their immigration status, and like you also don't want to make them look paranoid, right? When they might have some legit concerns because there are raids going on in their very neighborhood, And so just being mindful of that. And honestly, like you don't have to document everything. You just don't. And not everything is relevant. And so when in doubt, I would go back to that phrase of, if it's in the record, think about why. Like, why am I writing this down? Is it because I think it was extremely important? And if I don't write this down, like you would never understand anything about this client or about what happened in the session? Is it because I accept insurance and I have to write certain things down for insurance, right? These are all acceptable answers, and those answers will vary not only per clinician, but per client. So just thinking about like, if I have to write this down or if I want to write this down, why?
Thank you so much for spending some time with us and sharing your expertise with everybody. Where can people find out more about you and all of the wonderful information that you continue to put out there?
Yeah, thank you. I would say the best, so my website is qaprep.com. That's the best place to go. And I have a book, which is super exciting. And I am going to toot my horn and say it's amazing. And I've gotten tons of great feedback on the book. Highly recommend buying the book. So if you go to, the book is called Stress-Free Documentation for Mental Health Therapists, and it includes access to templates and lots of phrases that you can use and steal as cheat sheets for all the things, whether you work with insurance, whether you don't work with insurance. But it's essentially like you get a book on documentation, a training on documentation, and a paperwork packet all in one. So if you go to qaprep.com/book, that's where you'll find out where you can get that.
And you can also go to our show notes, mtsgpodcast.com, and we will include links to Melissa's stuff over there as well. Follow us on our social media, join our Facebook group, the Modern Therapist Group, to continue on with this and other conversations. And until next time, I'm Curt Widhalm with Katie Vernoy and Dr. Maelisa McCaffrey.
Over 225,000 practitioners already use Simple Practice to grow their business and simplify admin tasks that take time away from their clients. Isn't it time your EHR worked as hard as you do? Find out more at simplepractice.com.
Want expert training for your team or event? Katie and I offer engaging workshops with real-world strategies for modern therapists. Visit therapyreimagined.com to learn more and book today.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. Learn more about who we are and what we do at mtsgpodcast.com. You can also join us on Facebook and Twitter. And please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes.